Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about some niche and outdated, obsolete even, shotgun shells. Now originally I was going to talk about like all of the kind of obscure shotgun shells, kind of like I did with like the 22 long rifle, obscure 22 long rifle video and the 38 family video. I guess the 22 family is probably the better way to refer to that video. Regardless, if you're interested in those, I'll throw the links in the description. Today, we're going to go over kind of that same overall concept, but I'm going to wind up breaking up this category because we're talking about all shotguns. It's not like we're all shotgun cartridges or, a wide array of shotgun cartridges instead of just saying like really niche 12 gauges, because 12 gauges, 12 gauges, 12 gauges. Not a whole lot to talk about that we haven't already discussed in the 12 gauge cartridge discussion video. Would you be interested in that? Link in the description. So that being the case, we're going to focus on obscure and interesting cartridges that are larger than 10 gauge, with a little bit of a caveat on there that we'll talk about more as we go. Okay, now a couple of things to keep in mind whenever it is that we get past like 4 gauge. Once we get past 4 gauge, we're getting into some really weird, murky waters. In general, shotguns have their own kind of language that's associated with the different pieces and parts of them, which I did an entire video covering shotgun shell terms, which if you're interested in that, link in the description. And there's a lot of kind of almost outdated terms that are utilized with them. And there's also a time where, as self-contained cartridges were kind of climbing their way out of the primordial ooze of time, that some designations were getting thrown around that didn't wind up long-term meaning the things that they meant. So what do I mean by this? Well, whenever it is that we talk about bore versus gauge. So bore is supposed to be an actual measurement of the shotgun's bore. Gauge is supposed to be, I take X number of lead balls at the diameter of that particular shotgun cartridge, and I keep adding them until I reach a pound. Okay, so in a 12 gauge, it takes 12 of those balls stacked up in order to be able to achieve a pound. That is a 12 gauge. Now, of course, as we go up in gauge, we go down in diameter. So something like a 20 gauge. A 20 gauge is smaller than a 12 gauge, even though the number is not representative of that. But because of the number of lead balls it can hold, we now see where that difference arises at. That's different from 410 bore. 410 bore is sometimes colloquially referred to as 410 gauge. However, that is not correct. This is an actual measurement that's involved in it. So when we get to greater than 4 gauge, we run into a lot of issues where there are quite a few 4 gauges out there that are not 4 gauges. They're 5 or 6 gauges, just like there's some 2 gauges out there that actually, or bores that if you actually measure them, are closer to actually being a 4 gauge or 4 bore. And it's an interesting little thing. I think a lot of this also stems back to when we get into like punt guns and stuff like that. Now, punt guns, for those of you who don't know, were used in commercial bird hunting, in which you would literally mount like basically a cannon to the front of your little boat, and you would aim the boat at a flock of geese sitting on the water, and then you would annihilate that flock of geese, paddle your way through there, and pick up all the dead geese as you go. Eventually, this style of hunting would be outlawed in the United States and then also in Europe as well, but it was very important for early commercial styles of food production before we started like really getting farms off the ground, I guess, because I feel like that's a more efficient manner, a more consistent manner to be able to produce food as opposed to wiping them all out with a punt gun. But also at the same time, this more or less predates like the commercialization of farming and all that kind of stuff. So I get that as well. No farmer by any means, but I can understand the overall concept. Now, punt guns are different from swivel guns because swivel guns are meant to resist like boarding parties on ships and stuff like that, and punt guns are like literally more like the cannons on the side of the ship at that point. So when we get into the 4 gauges and like the 8 gauges and stuff like that, these are guns that were utilized for commercial style hunting, and we'll kind of discuss why it is that they wind up going the wayside overall. But while we're talking about the greater than 4 gauge or 4 bore options, we also need to go ahead and talk about African hunting. There are quite a few single projectile 4 bore and greater guns. In fact, Kentucky Ballistics actually did a video on a Ruger No. 1 chambered in 4 bore. Massive gun. Absolutely massive cartridge, which You guys should absolutely check out Kentucky Ballistics sometime if you hadn't. He plugged up his own artery with his thumb. That's pretty cool. Anyway, these were either rifled or non-rifled systems, and some composite versions of the above. So you would have a mostly unrifled bore, and then the choke would be rifled. The whole idea was that you had this very large weapon system shooting this very large cartridge, this very large projectile, possibly loaded with explosives in order to be able to harvest like large or extremely dangerous game. So elephants, and then they were also popular in India for tiger hunting. So that's an interesting little kind of crossover right there, and it's also indicative of like where we get a lot of these weird terms and stuff like that, because we're talking about early British hunting options in Africa. Everything that we're talking about right now, with aside from the punts, there are quite a few punts that were not cartridge guns, but for the most part, we are talking about cartridge or self-contained cartridge firearms. So that hasn't been clear, by the way. There were a lot of like flintlock and then percussion, front stuffed, or possibly even breech loaded, but still, individual portions of, the ammunition were loaded into it in order to be fired kind of like the traditional cannon, like a Parrott gun or something like that in the Civil War. All right, so that's the discussion of the greater than 4 gauge. Let's go ahead and get into 4 gauge itself, which technically, depending on what cartridges that you're using, may be technically a 6 gauge. A lot of times, if you look at the measurements for like paper cartridges, they're a 6 gauge. Apparently, if you have brass cased rounds, they are more likely to be an actual 4 gauge at that point. This was very popular for long range waterfowl hunting, not surprising. That's because in general, there are some very passive advantages in utilizing a very wide diameter cartridge. A lot of times people have a tendency to misconstrue how a shotgun pattern is formed. They have a tendency to think of it, especially because movies and video games have a tendency to make it look like there's just this wall of lead moving down range and everything in its path is going to be destroyed. It's not actually how that works. Most people think of shotgun patterns as being very similar to like a claymore, where you have basically a block of C4 with a bunch of ball bearings pressed into the front of it. And it's a very thin layer of ball bearings, and all these ball bearings move out in a hemispherical fashion, and it's more or less a wall of steel at that point moving down range, wipes out everything in its path. That is accurate. However, shotgun shot is stacked in columns. And just like those ball bearings in the claymore, that column is getting the impetus for movement all at the same time. Everything in it is. So it's going to come out looking more like a cloud than it is necessarily a wall of steel. Now, what we impact about that cloud is the overall diameter of the leading edge of that cloud, which I refer to as my snapshot, as my instantaneous impact. So ideally, my target is going to get hit in the lead portion of that cloud. And by having a greater diameter, I have a greater overall hit probability because there's more shot that can fill that space to be able to hit my target. This is also why shotgunners are taught to swing through targets, so that you can kind of change how that cloud looks a little bit, so that you can hopefully catch more of your target as it passes through. So 4 gauge would have a very tangible benefit of this, as well as by going with a larger overall diameter, you can fit more shot. Regardless of what size of shot you're throwing out there, you're going to be able to propel more of it. But at this time, velocity is limited because we're looking at black powder cartridges. And we'll talk about that more here as we go. So that's the 4 gauge. Let's go ahead and talk about the 8 gauge. The 8 gauge, also very popular for long-range bird hunting, as well as there's been apparent resurgence in popularity when it comes to like turkey hunting, but I've never seen an 8 gauge shotgun used for turkey hunting. Sound off in the comments section if you have one. I'd be really curious to know about it. So the 8 gauge was interesting because as we get closer to 12 gauge, the weapon systems that these cartridges are being chambered in become lighter. They become more man-portable. They become something that you can actually take into the field, as opposed to something that you need like a tripod to be able to shoot it off of, as we start to go the other direction, more towards punt gun at that point. The 8 gauge would be able to propel 1 3/4 ounces of shot up to 2 1/4 ounces of shot, if I remember correctly. I'll annotate down below if I got those numbers wrong. Up to about 1,200 feet per second. Now, in the late 1800s, that's fast, and that's a lot of shot, and that's a lot of increased probability to be able to make impacts and all that kind of stuff. But as we move into the 20th century, about got my centuries confused there for a second. As we moved into the 20th century, 12 gauge would really start to take over. And with modern propellants and modern ballistics and all this kind of stuff, the 12 gauge could be chambered in a lighter platform that could still perform on long-range waterfowl or on turkey or on rabbit or whatever it is that you need to do in order to be able to be more available. Or like, so at that point now, it being able to be so versatile allows it to be able to be used against more game, which means that one person can have one shotgun that pretty much works for everything, and they can, as time goes on, they can then start chambering it in magnum cartridges and all that kind of stuff. Now, of course, the 12 gauge is still stuck at that 12 gauge at its diameter, and increasing the shell length increases the amount of shot that you have on board, which doesn't necessarily do anything for that diameter. So I just have a longer stretched out cloud at that point. I don't necessarily have increased hit probability in the terms of that wider area to be filled in with shot. But the portability and all those types of things are what really allowed the 12 gauge to stand out and started forcing guns like the 8 gauge to the wayside. Especially because, like, oh, well, if you invest that same kind of effort into like the 8 gauge, then it would do that same kind of thing. Yes, but it's also heavier. You also have to have that interest, because shooting at a rabbit with an 8 gauge shotgun, you're not going to have much rabbit left at that point, or a squirrel, or pheasant, any of those types of birds. Those shotguns are really only good for long range shooting. Which kind of brings us into the 10 gauge, which I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on the 10 gauge. I've already done a whole video discussing the 10 gauge, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. But the 10 gauge, while it has almost been put to pasture by the 12 gauge, has managed to make some comebacks, because when you have somebody who's doing dedicated long range bird hunting, they do have very tangible benefits with the 10 gauge as opposed to trying to get the versatility out of the 12 gauge. So for the average person, the 12 gauge is exactly what they need. But for somebody who hunts professionally, does guided hunts and all that kind of stuff, trying to clean up wounded birds or birds that were missed out of the flock by whoever it is that they're guiding for, the 10 gauge still has strong following in those types of circumstances, and why it continues to be able to stick around. Now, I know I said we were going to talk about everything larger than 10 gauge, but there's also a very interesting little side note that I want to discuss real quick, which is the 11 gauge. I could not find a lot of information on the 11 gauge, other than it seems to be that a small number of custom guns and custom ammunition were produced in 11 gauge. I couldn't find a lot about like performance characteristics and all that kind of stuff. It sounds like some rich guy decided that he wanted something very different, and I don't know what drove him to decide that an 11 gauge custom gun was going to be more advantageous to him than a 12 gauge custom gun. It sounds like a very niche thing. Either niche because somebody just wanted to be different, or niche because somebody needed a precise shot cloud diameter for their purposes. Perhaps they felt that 10 gauge was the gun was going to be too heavy, and, you know, yes, it would be really great if they could have that amount of shot, but they needed more shot than they would have in a 12 gauge, and they wanted something on a lighter platform with less recoil, so they wound up going with an 11 gauge instead of just like sticking with 12 or biting the bullet with 10. Either way, it doesn't really matter, I guess, in this case. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.